A tit-for-tat trade battle is heating up, with prices climbing every time the dollar shifts. Washington has introduced a 10% flat tariff on all imports, and Brussels is hitting back with a 20% levy on U.S. goods, saying it wants to recover the same revenue. That puts $580 billion in EU exports and $320 billion in American exports, everything from Boeing to bourbon, BMW to soybeans, at risk of slamming into a double tariff wall. The European Union responded to Washington's tariff wall announcement in late summer 2025 with a bold warning. If this wall stays up, we'll build our own. And just like that, trade talks across the Atlantic became a high-stakes standoff. The current tension follows years of back and forth since the 2018 steel and aluminum dispute. That fight dragged on with committees, exemptions, and lawsuits. But now, Trump's return and his universal tariff plan has shaken the playing field. The U.S. policy is intentionally simple. 10% tariff on all non-U.S. imports, 30 to 45% on Chinese goods by sector, and a 12% cap on imports from nations outside NAFTA. Brussels quickly responded, citing equal treatment rules. The Commission president stated that if the U.S. doesn't reverse course, the EU tariff book will be updated with a 20% surcharge on critical U.S. exports. That sets the stage for a 10 to 20% transatlantic tariff squeeze. By the end of 2024, EU exports to the U.S. are projected to hit $580 billion, and a 20% tariff would burden exporters with $116 billion in added costs. Adjusted for the Fed's expected dollar policy, this might lower the hit to around $95 billion. Meanwhile, the U.S. sends $320 billion worth of goods to Europe each year. Brussels' 20% countermeasure would cost U.S. exporters another $64 billion. Economists say the net damage will land heavier on the U.S. Eurozone. PMI data shows export flows remain supported by local demand, but the U.S. relies heavily on imported parts, meaning price pass-through is inevitable. On June 24th, even before Washington's official announcement, Brussels responded with a hard stance. If the U.S. keeps the 10% tariff, we'll strike back in auto, aviation, and agriculture, they said. In Paris, Bruno Le Maire made it clear. We don't want mutual destruction, but we're prepared. From Boeing to soybeans, we have a list. In Berlin, after a quick call with Volkswagen, Economy Minister Robert Habeck said Germany could lose $110 billion in U.S. exports over 10 years. To cope, Berlin is working on trade deals with East Asia, especially for machinery, chemicals, and luxury vehicles. The German Industry Federation, or BDI, added that a 10% tariff could shrink production by 2.8%. In Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni tried to downplay her coalition partner's customs wall rhetoric, but even she admitted $3 billion in food and drink exports are vulnerable. Rome's economic chief, Giancarlo Giorgetti, chimed in, "If the U.S. lifts auto tariffs, we'll keep Prosecco and cheese on the table." From Sweden, Trade Minister Johan Forsell emphasized that $18 billion in high-tech exports are exposed. He said Ericsson and Volvo trucks would be directly hit and pledged full support for the EU's retaliation plans. Meanwhile, Wall Street celebrated Trump's flat tariff plan as a backdoor tax cut, but the Fed's FOMC minutes warned that these tariffs will raise inflation, pushing 10-year Treasury yields up by 14 basis points. The Peterson Institute modeled 3 outcomes. If the U.S. sticks with tariffs and retaliation follows, real GDP will drop by 1/3 of a point in the first quarter. Import prices would rise 10%, adding 1.3% to core CPI, and the Fed might have to hike interest rates by up to 50 basis points. That could raise mortgage rates by 40 basis points and corporate bond spreads by 60 basis points. Brussels' retaliation list is honestly pretty brutal. Boeing aircraft, Missouri corn, Ohio soybeans, California almonds, Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee guitars, even Hollywood digital content. You know, back in 2018, the EU carefully picked targets in Republican states to send a political message. This time, though, the list is broader. The EU says it's no holds barred. While high-tech and digital services, which make up about 40% of U.S. exports, are harder to tax, the EU can still shake global supply chains with tariffs on agriculture, aviation, and alcohol. The Airbus-Boeing rivalry is about to escalate. Airbus expects Boeing prices in Europe to rise by 20 to 25% due to EU tariffs, which would really weaken its delivery schedule. Boeing shares actually dropped 4.3% in early trading. The Trump camp says we'll bring companies back, cut corporate taxes, and use tariffs to fund growth. But the Fed's ability to fight inflation is shrinking. They're juggling risky tax cuts and the need to raise rates. In fact, Fed projections for the third quarter of 2025 now show a neutral rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. Markets say the dollar might strengthen, but exchange rate losses on exports could cancel out gains from tariffs. The first big warning comes from the auto sector. VW, BMW, and Mercedes send parts to the U.S. from plants in Mexico and Alabama. Around 28% of key components are EU-sourced. That 10% tariff pushes the German supply chain near the breaking point. The IFO Institute estimates a 2.8% contraction in German manufacturing if this drags on. Trump's effort to break price competition with Europe could backfire, causing higher prices for U.S. consumers and falling demand. This turns into a vicious cycle that actually worsens inflation. Brussels' deeper play? The green subsidy fight. The EU is preparing its own Net Zero Industry Act, countering America's Inflation Reduction Act from 2022. If tariffs go up, Brussels may remove green import subsidies, hitting U.S. electric vehicles with a carbon tax. That could tack on $4,000 to $5,000 to a Tesla Model Y in Europe. This fight is no longer just about trade. It's about who leads in the green economy. At the U.S.-EU Trade Summit in February, 3 outcomes are possible. 1. The U.S. shows flexibility and opens exceptions for allies. 2. The EU sets its base tariff at 15% and files a WTO case. 3. A full-on everyone loses scenario unfolds. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire says a global tariff shock would raise global inflation by up to 1%, force interest rate hikes, and tip poor nations into a debt crisis. In the short run, the U.S. manufacturing index will take the biggest hit. The Chicago Fed estimates that in industries where imports make up more than 35% of inputs, like cars, electronics, and appliances, producer prices will surge 4% within 6 months, with a 1 to 1.3% consumer hit. Even with Trump's second tax plan aimed at avoiding Fed hikes, passing it through Congress will be tough with the $1.8 trillion budget deficit. Wall Street execs are left with 2 bad choices: a fixed 10% tariff with limited EU retaliation, or a rhetorical trade war that just gets worse by the week. If Brussels pulls the trigger on full retaliation, U.S. aviation exports could fall by $15 billion. Boeing's 2024 order ratio could drop to 0.8. Agriculture would lose $8.5 billion, and Europe would shift energy deals, driving up LNG contract prices. Bottom line, Trump's tariff playbook may begin at 10%, but it could lead to a 40% trade Cold War if Europe, and potentially China and Mexico, retaliate fully. That would place 68% of U.S. imports under fire. Economic impact? Producer price index up 2 points, core CPI up 0.8 points, interest rate up 150 basis points, unemployment up 0.4%, productivity down 0.3 points. The EU's final message? Diplomacy is still possible, but if the U.S. refuses to open exemptions, the next phase of global inflation will begin, right in the shadow of tariffs. So, what do you think? Will this economic standoff escalate or cool down? Drop your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives like this.